My teacher said age is just a number when I confronted him about dating my classmate. 3 weeks later, I discovered he'd been doing this for 20 years. I was 19 when I first noticed something wrong between Mr. Garrison and Sophia from my advanced literature class. She was always staying after school for extra help, always getting extensions on assignments that the rest of us had to turn in on time. I figured she was just struggling with the material since she'd transferred in mid-semester from another state. But then I started noticing how he looked at her during class discussions, how his voice got softer when he called on her, how he found excuses to walk past her desk and brush against her shoulder. It made my stomach turn, but I told myself I was imagining things because teachers don't do that kind of stuff. The first real red flag came during our unit on Romeo and Juliet, when Mr. Garrison spent an entire class period defending their relationship against what he called modern prejudices about age differences. He kept emphasizing how Juliet was mature for her years and how true love transcends societal expectations about appropriate partnerships. Most of the class looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything because he was the teacher, and we were just students. Sophia sat in the front row taking notes like it was the most important lecture she'd ever heard, nodding along with every word. After class, I heard him ask her to stay behind to discuss her essay, and I lingered in the hallway pretending to organize my backpack. Through the open door, I could hear their conversation getting quieter and more personal. He was asking about her living situation, whether she felt supported at home, if she had anyone she could really talk to about important things. She told him her parents worked long hours and didn't really understand her interests in literature and writing. He said he recognized her potential and wanted to help her develop it properly, that she was different from other students her age, more intellectually mature. The way he said it made my skin crawl, but I didn't know what to do with that feeling. When they finally came out, Sophia looked flushed and excited, while Mr. Garrison had this satisfied expression that reminded me of a cat who'd caught a mouse. Over the next few weeks, their relationship became impossible to ignore. Sophia started dressing differently, wearing makeup to school, and choosing outfits that seemed more appropriate for someone going to work than sitting in a high school classroom. She'd arrive early and stay late, always finding reasons to be in Mr. Garrison's room even when she didn't have his class that period. During lunch, she'd sit alone reading books he'd recommended, complex novels that none of us had heard of, underlining passages and writing notes in the margins. When other students tried to talk to her about normal things like weekend plans or upcoming tests, she'd get this distant look like we were all children, and she'd outgrown our concerns. The breaking point came when I saw them together at a coffee shop downtown on a Saturday afternoon. I was there with my mom buying supplies for a school project when I spotted them in a corner booth, sitting way too close and talking in hushed tones. Mr. Garrison was leaning across the table, his hand covering hers, speaking intensely while she stared at him with this dreamy expression. They looked exactly like a couple on a date, not a teacher helping a struggling student. When they got up to leave, he put his hand on the small of her back to guide her toward the door, a gesture so intimate and possessive that I felt sick watching it. I ducked behind a display rack so they wouldn't see me, my heart pounding as they walked past. That Monday I decided I had to say something, but I wasn't sure who to tell or how to explain what I'd witnessed without sounding like I was making accusations I couldn't prove. During study hall, I worked up the courage to approach another teacher, Mrs. Fleming, who seemed approachable and had always been kind to students who came to her with problems. I knocked on her classroom door and asked if I could speak with her privately about something that was bothering me. She invited me in and closed the door, then sat across from me with this patient expression that made me feel like maybe I was doing the right thing by coming forward. I started by explaining that I'd noticed some concerning behavior between Mr. Garrison and one of our classmates, that their relationship seemed inappropriate for a teacher and student. Mrs. Fleming's expression grew serious as I described the after-school meetings, the way he spoke to Sophia differently than other students, the coffee shop encounter that looked distinctly like a romantic date. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment before asking if I was absolutely certain about what I'd seen and whether I might have misinterpreted innocent interactions. The doubt in her voice made me second-guess everything I'd just told her, wondering if I was overreacting to normal teacher-student mentorship. She thanked me for bringing my concerns to her attention and said she would handle the situation appropriately, but warned me against spreading rumors or talking to other students about my suspicions. Gossip could destroy an innocent man's career, she emphasized, and I needed to be very careful about making accusations without concrete proof. The conversation left me feeling confused and guilty, like I'd done something wrong by reporting what I'd observed. I walked out of her classroom wondering if I'd just ruined a good teacher's reputation over my own misunderstanding of a perfectly normal mentoring relationship. Nothing changed over the following weeks. If anything, Mr. Garrison and Sophia became more brazen about their connection, exchanging meaningful glances during class and finding increasingly transparent excuses for private conversations. She started wearing a delicate gold bracelet that none of us had seen before, touching it constantly like it was precious to her. When another student commented on how pretty it was, Sophia got flustered and mumbled something about it being a gift from a family member. But I'd seen Mr. Garrison wearing a matching chain around his neck, and the coincidence seemed too specific to ignore. The situation escalated when Sophia stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria altogether disappearing during that period and reappearing for afternoon classes, with this glow that suggested she'd been somewhere much more interesting than the library. One day I decided to follow her, hanging back at a distance as she made her way through the halls and out a side exit that led to the staff parking lot. From behind a concrete pillar, I watched her get into Mr. Garrison's car, where he was waiting with the engine running. They drove off campus together, returning separately just before fifth period, with elaborate stories about where they'd been if anyone bothered to ask. I felt like I was the only person who could see what was happening, trapped in some horrible version of the Emperor's New Clothes, where everyone else was pretending not to notice the obvious truth in front of our faces. The other students in our class either genuinely didn't see anything wrong or were too intimidated to speak up about a teacher's behavior. Even Sophia's friends seemed to accept her explanation that Mr. Garrison was helping her with college preparation and scholarship applications, requiring extra time and individual attention to ensure her success. They envied the special treatment rather than recognizing it as the grooming behavior it so clearly was. By spring semester, Sophia had become almost completely isolated from her peer group, spending all her free time either with Mr. Garrison or alone with the books and assignments he gave her. She'd developed this sophisticated vocabulary and way of speaking that set her apart from other students, using literary references and philosophical concepts in casual conversation like she was trying to prove her intellectual maturity. When classmates invited her to parties or movie nights, she'd decline with this pitying smile, explaining that she was focused on more meaningful pursuits than typical teenage activities. One afternoon, I finally worked up the courage to confront him directly about what I'd observed. I stayed after class when the other students had left and approached his desk, where he was grading papers with his usual focused intensity. My voice shook as I told him I knew about his relationship with Sophia and that it needed to stop immediately. He looked up from his work with this calm, almost amused expression, setting down his red pen and folding his hands on the desk between us. His response chilled me to the bone with its casual confidence and complete lack of shame or denial. "Age is just a number when you find real intellectual and emotional connection," he said, speaking to me like I was a child who wouldn't understand adult complexities. "Sophia is far more mature than her chronological age suggests, and she appreciates having someone in her life who can challenge her mind and help her grow as a person. Society's arbitrary rules about appropriate relationships often prevent meaningful connections between people who genuinely care about each other." He explained this like he was teaching me a valuable lesson about the world, his voice taking on the same professorial tone he used during literature discussions when he wanted to make sure we understood important themes. I told him that what he was doing was illegal and harmful, that Sophia was still a minor, and he was in a position of authority over her. His expression hardened, and he stood up from his desk, moving closer until he was towering over me in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. He reminded me that I was making serious accusations against a respected teacher based on nothing more than jealousy and misunderstanding. Perhaps I was upset that I wasn't receiving the same level of individual attention, he suggested. Or maybe I was confused about the nature of mentorship relationships because I'd never experienced one myself. The conversation ended with him warning me to be very careful about spreading malicious rumors that could destroy his reputation and career. False accusations had consequences, he emphasized, and I needed to think seriously about whether I wanted to be responsible for ruining an innocent man's life because of my own misconceptions. He sat back down and returned to his grading like our conversation had never happened, dismissing me with the kind of cold indifference that made it clear he wasn't worried about my threats or my knowledge of his behavior. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to convince other adults who seemed determined to protect Mr. Garrison, I started documenting evidence of his inappropriate relationship with Sophia. I began carrying a small notebook where I recorded dates, times, and descriptions of their interactions. I noted when she missed lunch period and returned with him, when they had private meetings after school, when he showed favoritism in grading or class participation. I photographed his car in the parking lot during lunch periods when Sophia was missing, creating a timeline of their off-campus meetings. 3 weeks into my surveillance, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. While researching Mr. Garrison online to see if there were any public records about his teaching history, I found a news article from a small-town newspaper dated 7 years ago. The headline read, "Local teacher resigns amid student relationship allegations." The article was brief, but mentioned that a high school literature teacher named David Garrison had left his position following an internal investigation into inappropriate conduct with a female student. No charges were filed, and the article noted that both the teacher and school district declined to comment on the specifics of the allegations. I spent hours searching for more information, using different search terms and digging through archived news sites and social media posts. What I found painted a disturbing picture of a man who had been moving from school to school, leaving behind a trail of inappropriate relationships with students. In one town, concerned parents had started a petition demanding his removal after rumors circulated about his behavior with multiple female students. In another, a local forum had posts from alumni warning younger students to avoid being alone with him. The pattern was consistent, dating back nearly 2 decades. The most chilling discovery came when I found a yearbook photo from his first teaching position in 1999. He looked exactly the same as he did now, which meant he'd been perfecting his predatory behavior for over 20 years. The inscription under his photo read, "Future Authors Club Sponsor," and I wondered how many young writers he'd manipulated over the years, with promises of mentorship and literary guidance. How many Sophias had there been before her, young women whose dreams and aspirations he'd exploited to gain their trust and compliance? Armed with this information, I decided to reach out to some of his former students directly. Through social media, I managed to contact 3 women who had attended schools where Mr. Garrison had previously taught. 2 of them responded to my messages, and what they told me confirmed my worst fears about his systematic pattern of abuse. The first woman, now in her 30s, described being groomed by him when she was 16. He'd convinced her that their relationship was special and secret, showering her with attention and gifts, while gradually isolating her from friends and family who might interfere. The second woman had a similar story, though her experience had occurred at a different school 5 years later. She told me that Mr. Garrison had used the exact same tactics with her that I was witnessing with Sophia, right down to the coffee shop meetings and the sophisticated books he recommended to make her feel mature beyond her years. Both women expressed regret that they'd never reported his behavior, fearing they wouldn't be believed or that they'd somehow brought it upon themselves by accepting his attention and gifts. What struck me most about their stories was how calculated and deliberate his approach had been. These weren't momentary lapses in judgment or cases of inappropriate attraction that had spiraled out of control. This was a methodical predator who had refined his techniques over decades, learning from each experience how to better manipulate vulnerable young women into relationships they were too young to understand or consent to meaningfully. He targeted students who were isolated, academically gifted but socially insecure, often from troubled home situations where they craved adult attention and validation. The next morning, I went to school with printouts of every article I'd found, screenshots of my conversations with his former victims, and detailed documentation of his current behavior with Sophia. Instead of approaching another teacher or administrator who might dismiss my concerns again, I walked straight to the main office and asked to speak with the principal immediately. When his secretary said he was in a meeting, I told her it was an emergency involving student safety and that I would wait as long as necessary to speak with him personally. Principal Matthews finally agreed to see me after keeping me waiting for 40 minutes, clearly annoyed at being interrupted by what he assumed was a minor student complaint. His attitude changed dramatically when I placed my research on his desk and began explaining what I'd discovered about Mr. Garrison's history. As he read through the articles and looked at the evidence I'd compiled, his face grew pale and his hands began to shake slightly. He asked me to sit down and called his secretary to cancel his remaining appointments for the morning. For the next 2 hours, we went through every piece of evidence I'd gathered, with Principal Matthews taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about dates, times, and locations of the incidents I'd documented. He seemed particularly disturbed by the pattern of Mr. Garrison's behavior across multiple schools and the fact that school districts had apparently allowed him to resign quietly rather than facing consequences for his actions. When I finished presenting my case, he thanked me for my courage in coming forward and assured me that immediate action would be taken to protect Sophia and investigate the allegations thoroughly. The first step was removing Mr. Garrison from the classroom while the investigation proceeded. Principal Matthews called the district office to report the situation and request an emergency meeting with the superintendent and legal counsel. Within 2 hours, Mr. Garrison was summoned to the main office and informed that he was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation of serious allegations regarding inappropriate conduct with students. His teaching credentials were suspended immediately, and he was escorted from the building by district security personnel. The speed of the response shocked me, especially after my earlier experience with Mrs. Fleming's dismissive reaction to my concerns. Principal Matthews explained that the documentation I'd provided left the district no choice but to act immediately and decisively. The evidence of Mr. Garrison's pattern of behavior across multiple schools created liability issues that required immediate intervention. Moreover, the current situation with Sophia presented an ongoing risk to student safety that couldn't be ignored or handled with internal discipline alone. Sophia's reaction to Mr. Garrison's sudden disappearance was heartbreaking to witness. She seemed completely lost and confused, asking other teachers where he was and when he would be returning to class. Her academic performance immediately began to suffer as she struggled to focus on assignments without his constant attention and praise. During lunch periods, she sat alone in the library looking devastated, no longer interested in the sophisticated books he'd recommended or the intellectual pursuits that had previously consumed her time. 2 days after Mr. Garrison's removal, Detective Linda Martinez from the county sheriff's office arrived at school to interview students who had been in his classes. The investigation had expanded beyond the school district to include potential criminal charges for his behavior with Sophia and possibly other students. Detective Martinez spoke with me first, since I was the one who had brought the allegations forward and had the most comprehensive documentation of his inappropriate conduct. The interview lasted over 3 hours, during which Detective Martinez went through every detail of my evidence and asked me to clarify specific incidents and timelines. She was particularly interested in the off-campus meetings I'd documented and the gifts I'd observed him giving to Sophia. She explained that these could constitute evidence of grooming behavior and potentially criminal sexual conduct, depending on what other evidence the investigation uncovered. My photographs and detailed notes were entered into the official case file as evidence. Sophia was interviewed separately by Detective Martinez and a social worker from Child Protective Services. The interview took place at the district office rather than the police station to make it less intimidating for her. Afterward, Sophia didn't return to school for the rest of that week. Her parents had removed her from classes while they processed what they'd learned about her relationship with Mr. Garrison and arranged for counseling to help her understand and cope with what had happened to her. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement became involved. Detective Martinez obtained search warrants for Mr. Garrison's personal devices, school-issued computer, and classroom, uncovering a treasure trove of evidence that painted a disturbing picture of his predatory behavior. His phone contained hundreds of text messages with Sophia that became increasingly inappropriate over time, starting with academic discussions and gradually escalating to romantic and sexual content. He'd been systematically grooming her for months, using classic manipulation tactics to normalize the progression of their relationship. Even more disturbing were the files Detective Martinez found on his personal computer. He had detailed notes about multiple students across several schools, tracking their personal information, family situations, academic performance, and psychological vulnerabilities. The files read like hunting notes, with observations about which students might be susceptible to his manipulation and detailed strategies for approaching them. Some files contained photographs of students taken without their knowledge, along with personal details about their schedules and habits. The computer evidence revealed that Sophia was just the latest in a long line of victims spanning Mr. Garrison's entire career. Detective Martinez found correspondence with former students from multiple schools, some dating back over 15 years. Many of these relationships had followed the same pattern I'd observed with Sophia, beginning with academic mentorship and evolving into inappropriate personal relationships. The evidence suggested that he'd been sexually involved with at least a dozen underage students over the course of his career. Armed with this evidence, Detective Martinez contacted law enforcement agencies in the other jurisdictions where Mr. Garrison had taught. Within days, a multi-state investigation was underway as police departments compared notes and reached out to his former students who were now adults. The story began making national news as the scope of his predatory behavior became clear and more victims came forward to share their experiences. The media attention brought additional victims out of the shadows, women who had been students of Mr. Garrison's years, or even decades earlier. They described experiences virtually identical to what I'd witnessed with Sophia, confirming that his methods had remained remarkably consistent throughout his career. Local news stations interviewed some of these women, their faces obscured and voices disguised to protect their privacy, but their stories were heartbreakingly similar in their details of manipulation, grooming, and abuse of trust. One woman, now a mother herself, described being 16 when Mr. Garrison convinced her that their relationship was a beautiful secret, that mature people like them could understand, but that others would misinterpret. Another spoke about how he'd isolated her from friends and family, making her believe that he was the only person who truly understood her artistic talents and intellectual potential. These women had carried shame and confusion about their experiences for years, many never reporting the abuse because they'd been convinced it was their fault for being special enough to earn his attention. The psychological damage he'd inflicted on his victims became increasingly clear as more stories emerged. Several women described struggling with relationships throughout their adult lives, having difficulty trusting their own judgment about appropriate boundaries after being manipulated during their formative teenage years. Others talked about the impact on their self-esteem and educational goals, how his attention had made them feel special initially, but ultimately left them feeling used and discarded when he inevitably moved on to new victims. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Mr. Garrison's behavior had been an open secret at several of the schools where he'd taught. Colleagues had noticed his inappropriate interest in female students, but had either looked the other way or reported concerns to administrators who chose to handle the situation quietly to avoid scandal. The pattern of moving him from school to school, rather than facing the problem directly, had enabled decades of abuse and put countless students at risk. The school district where I was a student faced enormous liability for their role in allowing Mr. Garrison to continue teaching after his problematic history should have been discoverable through proper background checks and reference verification. Parents filed lawsuits demanding accountability for the district's failure to protect their children, and several administrators faced termination or forced resignation for their handling of previous complaints about his behavior. Sophia gradually began to understand the true nature of her relationship with Mr. Garrison as she worked with counselors and learned about grooming tactics and abuse dynamics. The process was painful and difficult, requiring her to reframe experiences she'd treasured as evidence of being special and mature into recognition that she'd been systematically manipulated and exploited. Her parents struggled with guilt over missing the warning signs and anger at the school system for failing to protect their daughter. 3 months after the investigation began, Mr. Garrison was arrested on multiple felony charges, including sexual misconduct with minors, abuse of authority, and violation of his position of trust. Additional charges were filed in other states as more victims came forward and law enforcement agencies coordinated their cases. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including digital records, witness testimony, and his own detailed documentation of his predatory activities. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of his calculated approach to identifying and exploiting vulnerable students. Expert witnesses testified about grooming behaviors and the psychological techniques predators use to normalize inappropriate relationships with minors. The prosecution presented evidence showing how Mr. Garrison had refined his methods over decades, becoming increasingly sophisticated in his ability to manipulate both students and the adults around them who might otherwise intervene. Mr. Garrison ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple charges rather than face trial, likely hoping to avoid the additional evidence that would have been presented in court. His plea agreement included substantial prison time and lifetime registration as a sex offender, ensuring that any future contact with minors would trigger immediate scrutiny from law enforcement. The judge described his crimes as a profound violation of the trust placed in educators and noted the lasting damage he'd inflicted on countless young lives. The case sparked nationwide discussions about policies and procedures designed to prevent predators from moving between schools and continuing to abuse students. Education organizations implemented new requirements for background checks, reference verification, and mandatory reporting of suspected abuse. Several states passed legislation closing loopholes that had previously allowed problematic teachers to resign quietly and find new positions without disclosure of their disciplinary history. For Sophia, the healing process continued long after the legal proceedings concluded. She transferred to a different school to escape the attention and whispers that followed her, starting fresh in an environment where she could focus on her education without being defined by her experience as a victim. With counseling and support from her family, she gradually rebuilt her sense of self and learned to trust her own judgment about relationships and boundaries. The investigation also revealed that I hadn't been the only student who had noticed Mr. Garrison's inappropriate behavior with Sophia. Several other classmates had felt uncomfortable with what they'd observed, but hadn't known how to report their concerns or had been discouraged by adults who minimized their observations. The case became a teaching moment about the importance of trusting instincts and speaking up when something seems wrong, even when adults might initially dismiss those concerns. My decision to document evidence and persist in reporting despite initial dismissal was credited with preventing further abuse and bringing justice for multiple victims. Detective Martinez told me that without my detailed records and willingness to come forward, the investigation might never have begun, and Mr. Garrison could have continued his predatory behavior indefinitely. The knowledge that my actions had protected other potential victims helped me process my own complicated feelings about the situation. In the aftermath of Mr. Garrison's conviction, I found myself reflecting on the broader implications of what had happened and the systemic failures that had enabled decades of abuse. The case highlighted how predators often exploit institutional cultures that prioritize reputation over student safety, and how important it is for young people to have trusted adults who will listen to their concerns without dismissing them as misunderstandings or overreactions. The experience shaped my understanding of power dynamics, manipulation, and the vulnerability of young people in educational settings. It also reinforced my belief in the importance of documentation and evidence when reporting serious allegations, as well as the courage required to persist when initial reports are dismissed or minimized. The case became a catalyst for policy changes and increased awareness that hopefully prevented similar situations from occurring at other schools. 6 months later, Mr. Garrison was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. Sophia graduated early and started college in another state. The school district paid out $3.2 million in settlements to his victims. 3 administrators were fired, and the superintendent resigned in disgrace. I received a citizen's commendation from the governor for my role in exposing the abuse. Sometimes doing the right thing means everyone else has to face the truth they've been avoiding.